Hello there, and welcome to A Film A Day with me, Jordan Woodley. And yes, I love being back at the cinema. That's right, another cinema viewing, this time with Edgar Wright's latest murder mystery ghost thriller. I'll explain the question mark there as I get into the review, but yes, Edgar Wright's latest film, Last Night in Soho. I mean, I've talked previously in videos about how influential Edgar Wright is to me personally. Just as I was coming of age was the time when I found films like Shaun of the Dead and Hot Fuzz, and the craftsmanship and balance of humour whilst also a sense of genre knowledge. Edgar Wright's ability to be able to create that formed my love of genre, and therefore going forward I've always been a huge fan of his work, and even the films I don't like, I appreciate the detail orientated nature of his style. I mean, as I say, it's not every film of mine is my favourite. Like, for instance, I was never the biggest fan of Scott Pilgrim. It has a certain style to it that just doesn't appeal to me. This very sort of manic, sort of tireless, hyperactive style. It just didn't appeal to me in a way that I thought was more seamless in a film like Hot Fuzz. World's End, admittedly, with enough time having passed, I do think I need to go back and rewatch World's End. I think the problem for me was there had been so much build-up with the first two parts of the Cornetto trilogy that when it came to World's End, it had a significant amount of time had passed between Hot Fuzz and World's End. And I think the build-up of what I wanted and what the film ended up being just didn't line up. But actually, in hindsight, I actually do think it probably is a very well-made film, a very good film. It wasn't what I wanted at the time. And I have to say, I do love Baby Driver. Baby Driver is a great film and really shows Edgar Wright's versatility. The fact that, it's a very different film from the Cornetto trilogy or Scott Pilgrim. It really feels like it's within his oeuvre, but it really shows how versatile he can be as a director and a story creator. So I was very excited for Last Night in Soho, because this really was showing an even greater sense of range within the kind of story that he was telling. I mean, he touched on styles that he'd done before, of course, ghosts and the supernatural, the murder mystery aspect, but then, a female-driven film with two-ish female leads. I mean, I'll elaborate on why. Primarily there is one, but there are two female. It is a female-driven film with two leading performances. But again, still very different from what had come before from Edgar Wright. This isn't a comedy at all. This is a very serious, dark film with leading more into a thriller style than anything that even something like Baby Driver, which isn't humorous, but definitely has this sort of bounce to it, and there's something almost fun about some of the heists. This is definitely a much darker, more contemplative film. To sort of talk very briefly through the plot, so Thomasin Mackenzie plays a girl named Eloise, or Elle, from Cornwall, who moves to London, having acquired a acceptance to a fashion school. And it's very much the sort of small town girl, the country girl, being drawn in by the bright lights of London, but it not really living up to her expectations. On top of that, as she arrives at this fashion school, she's sort of confronted by sort of your queen bee bitch type character, a very alcohol party laden community of people that just she's presented as a bit stranger and a bit less engaged with sort of the modern society, veering more towards styles and interests of the 60s. And so she just feels out of place. There's something almost of the Saint Maud about it. I mean, Saint Maud is a very different film, very different, but the idea of this figure who doesn't necessarily stand out in the way that she doesn't fit in, but it's very obvious that she is just completely out of sync with the world around her, and she doesn't know how to get into rhythm with everything else. So she goes to this house where she rents a room whilst studying, and then as she's renting the room, I mean, the other key factor about her character is the fact that she sees ghosts. This is just a fact of her character. Yes, you can interpret whether she's actually seeing ghosts or whether it's something more psychological, but within the body of the narrative, she is seeing ghosts. And then on top of that, she starts to have dreams which take her back to the 1960s, where, and this is, I suppose, where she experiences the life of a girl called Sandy, who's played by Anya Taylor-Joy, who, very much like her, has arrived in London to sort of make her fortune, but in her case, she wants to be a singer-dancer. And so she arrives sort of ready to dive into the heady world of performing in 60s London, and gets involved with Matt Smith, and it all sort of starts to, be everything that Eloise wants out of her life. She's seeing through Anya Taylor-Joy's lens, and she's seeing this culture that she absolutely craves, as in her own life she's becoming more sort of withdrawn and feeling significantly out of place in the world, in the culture around her. But then the nature of the Anya Taylor-Joy story starts to get significantly darker, and people who seemed friendly but are much creepier, and everything starts to take a very sinister twist. So of course Eloise becomes involved in trying to find out what's going on there, whilst also trying to resolve her own problems. And it's a really cool concept, the two time frames, the fact that you've got almost Quantum Leap style. You've got Eloise who goes to sleep and jumps into Anya Taylor-Joy's story. Sometimes it's like she's seeing it through her eyes, sometimes it's like she's a ghost observing her from the sidelines. And then of course you've got this ghostly aspect to it, the fact that she sees the ghosts of random people throughout the city. She's being confronted by people who seem to know her, especially as her and Sandy start to sort of, an overlap occurs between them. And then of course in the 60s you get that dark thriller sense of things, and as I say, the concept is really strong at its core, and these two performances are really good. I mean, Thomasin McKenzie is so great because she needs to play this character who balances vulnerability, and someone who like I said, there's a timidity and vulnerability to her personality, and yet there's a strength to her because she is unlike anyone around her. And of course Anya Taylor-Joy is almost the inverse of that, where she is nothing but confidence and bullshiness, and yet underneath it all she's actually incredibly vulnerable and is easily exploited. And as she develops a relationship with Matt Smith's character, those vulnerabilities start to become extremely exposed. And like I said, there's a really strong feminist narrative there. I mean, it's about the idea of being, sort of a young woman in a big city like London, being isolated, and the whole thing about isolation, whether it be what isolation looks like nowadays or what isolation looked like 50 years ago. And you have moments where characters you think are friendly shift from friendliness to sinister. I mean, there's a great moment early on with a taxi driver, see a conversation that very quickly it becomes a risk assessment, I suppose, where a guy who seems to just seem chatty, all of a sudden it becomes very apparent that this sinister subtext to what he's saying, in a way that a character like Ella, as a young woman, immediately susses and immediately has to sort of decide her vulnerability in that situation and what exactly she is able to do to protect herself. And so I think, like I say, at the core there is a really cool idea there, and a really deep, there's a significant amount of depth to be able to explore this idea. And then you've got the sort of Suspiria or Neon Demon style fashion school stuff, which is, I know with Suspiria it's a dance school, but that same sense of sinister, so that, in the fashion culture, the threat that comes from there, and people who you think might be a friend turn out to very quickly become an enemy. And like I said, there's a lot going on in this film, and significant amount of layers and interesting characters. It just, thinking about it right now, in this very moment, I think at the core the problem is it may be too much. I've been saying since seeing it that I wonder whether the film, there wasn't enough time. That the film needed another 30 minutes added to it, because the problem is there are so many characters and stories and themes and settings, and it tries to set so much up that in the first half you really do get that. You get a breadth of characters who each have interesting backstories and setups, and you can feel the sense of, as I say with Edgar Wright, there's a real detail orientation to it, where you get that sense that he's laying really well-considered groundwork for characters that he's very keen to play with and explore different aspects of their personalities. But the second half really drops those. So many characters just don't do anything, or if they do stuff, there's no real resolution. Characters seem to, I don't know, there seems to be an escalation in certain characters' actions, and then there's no real payoff, or no confrontation or decompression from the characters that they've built. I mean, as I say, it turns into a murder mystery to some degree, but the murder mystery aspect only really comes in the second half, and even then it feels very rushed and not that engaging. I didn't feel like it was a murder mystery where I felt like it thought it was a more intricate murder mystery than it was, and maybe if there had been more time it would have been, but because it had to very quickly establish the fact that it's a murder mystery and then resolve that, I didn't find it hugely compelling. I didn't find the mystery significantly intriguing, and I don't know, it just really lost itself in that second half, especially into the climax and then the epilogue. It just really feels like a film that ran out of steam. And it really is a shame, because, as I say, a lot of work is done to establish a fascinating ensemble of characters and settings. It just doesn't feel like there's the time to be able to explore them. There's this great sense of culture to it. When we first get to the 60s with Anya Taylor-Joy, you really feel like it's got a very Baz Luhrmann, Great Gatsby sense to it, where it's just an explosion of culture. And just like Anya Taylor-Joy's like Sandy, you're supposed to almost be overwhelmed by just, this period setting. And then it loses it. And there comes a point where the fact that it's set in the 60s is almost arbitrary. Because it's no longer really about the 60s, it's more about this murder mystery. And I just feel like I can't quite put together why the pieces didn't form in a way that gave me a sort of a satisfying whole to the narrative. I wonder as well, thinking about it, whether Baby Driver suffers from that to a lesser degree, because I enjoyed 90% of Baby Driver. The only issue I had, as I said in the video for Baby Driver, is that I felt like the ending didn't. There were certain plot aspects of the ending and character beats that just didn't really make sense and tie together in a way that was as satisfactory as some of Edgar Wright's earlier stuff. And I think this is a further demonstration of that. That again, it just doesn't seem to be able to build to a climax that satisfies all of the plot beats and characters and all the setup. It just feels... Not that it ends flatly, because there is a big climax to the ending, but it feels like it doesn't justify everything that has been built within the narrative. It's difficult to say whether I like this or not, because like I said, the first half is great, and I do think it's got this great set of characters and interesting settings, and Edgar Wright's directorial style is littered throughout the film, beginning to end. But I don't know, it just doesn't, the parts don't feel like the sum of the whole. It just doesn't come together, and when it comes to an Edgar Wright property, when you look at something like Shaun of the Dead, like the original Cornetto trilogy, Shaun of the Dead, Hot Fuzz, and At World's End, which are House of Card narratives that require everything to be perfectly placed. It feels like as his career has gone on, and the necessity for that has lessened, it feels like he's not maintaining that level of quality to it, or level of detail and structure to it, because it's more about style and aesthetic, and you have these cool scenes, set pieces with ghosts, but it just doesn't, I don't know, it just doesn't come together in a way that makes me go, yes, this is a great film. It's fun and interesting, but it is definitely one of Edgar Wright's filmography, probably one of my lesser, one of the lesser ones, and probably one that I'm probably going to be hesitate to revisit. We'll see. Anyway, thank you for joining me. If you like this video, hit the like button, comment below, and share the video, because it's all helping in the algorithm. Subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to get notifications for when new videos are uploaded. Check out my back catalogue of over 250 videos, and follow me on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley, where I tweet about TV shows and films, and I share these videos once they're uploaded to YouTube, either the day of or the day after. Thank you for joining me. Take care.